We'll first begin by reading the introduction by Stephen Byington. I will first begin by reading the James Martin editor's introduction to this edition of the Stephen Byington translation of Max Stirner's The Ego and His Own. "50 years, sooner or later, can make little difference in the case of a book so revolutionary as this." This was the opening sentence of James L. Walker's introduction to the first English-language issuance of Max Stirner's Der Einzige und sein Agenten by Benjamin Tucker in 1907. It is probably as succinct and concise a summarization of the significance of the book as has ever been uttered. But Walker has not been the only one to speak of Stirner in this manner. 2 years later, James Huneker, in his famous evaluation, referred to the book as the most revolutionary ever written. He has left behind him a veritable breviary of destruction, a striking and dangerous book, Huneker declared. It is dangerous in every sense of the word, to socialism, to politicians, to hypocrisy. There is little doubt that The Ego and His Own is one of the most formidable assaults on authoritarianism ever launched. It may even belong in the first position as such. It is at once a historical document, a pamphlet of the intellectual disturbance of the mid-19th century, and a timeless classic. Its persistent reappearance in one language or another in the last 100 years testifies to the latter. However, the attention to Stirner has not been smooth and steady, but rather irregular and spasmodic. Its appearance in English for the first time was a product of one of these surges of interest, largely ignited by the great impact of Friedrich Nietzsche, especially between 1885 and 1910. As a consequence, Stirner was attached to the tail of Nietzsche's comet as a precursor, though he had been a comet in his own right before Nietzsche had even been old enough to learn to walk. It is not of prime significance that Max Stirner's life be stressed here, though a few items of substance may be mentioned. He was born Johann Caspar Schmidt in Bayreuth, Germany, on October 25th, 1806. The name he adopted as a pseudonym was originally a nickname from student days, a reference to his broad, high forehead. His career prior to the writing of his first and major book was obscure, though it included education in 3 universities and half a dozen years' experience in teaching. His first wife died in childbirth in 1838, and he remarried in 1843, which also appears to be the date when he began to draw together his thoughts and material into the book which was to shock and outrage a goodly portion of intellectual Germany the year after, and subsequently the whole Western world. From internal evidence it appears that he completed Der Einzige sometime in February or March 1844. A rather expert job book production followed, for, although the book bore the date 1845, it was actually in the hands of readers in November 1844. The Leipzig house of Otto Wigand issued it in an octavo volume of about 500 pages. Stirner's book came out at a stormy time in Western and Central European affairs. France, Italy, and the whole German world were in furious distress caused by the pressure of liberalism upon the monarchical structures of politics in these lands, clamouring for a voice in the making of public policy and running of affairs. And in the background and the underground boiled the propaganda of socialism, supervised by a score or more of expert tenders of mainly French and German origin. The philosophical proponents of the powerful national secular state had also made their appearance, and the polished thought of Johann Gottlieb Fichte and George William Friedrich Hegel, in particular the latter, had made a deep impression on the thinkers of the whole political spectrum at the time. In a way, Stirner was both a product and a victim of these factors. His book came out of them, and it was buried in the avalanche of the revolutions of March 1848 and thereafter. But in the interval between its publication and the uprising of the 48ers, a lively intellectual conflict spread. Few books have aroused such hostility and general disparagement as Stirner's, though it was not the author's intent to avoid a battle by any means. His spirited polemics against the principal figures among the so-called left Hegelians, the Jung Hegelianer, particularly Ludwig Feuerbach and Bruno Bauer invited reprisal, let alone his equally rousing tilt with the socialists, especially Wilhelm Weitling and Moses Hess. Stirner represented a third force in these agitated times. Neither a defender of the theological or monarchical state, nor a protagonist of the secular models advanced by the liberals and socialists. His views were as shocking and repellent to the latter as to the former, and Stirner went into almost total eclipse in the following 40 years, while the modern secular state took shape, with its distinctive homogenization of the new nationalism and socialism, and the surviving but mutated strains of the earlier divine right and ecclesiastical authority, plus the ingredients consisting of the enfranchised and compulsorily armed masses which the French Revolution contributed. Stirner's principal intellectual and social company had been the Berliners of Hegelian inspiration, and tendencies whom he had encountered at Hibbel's restaurant, who were known as Die Freien in some circles. These bold spirits included Ludwig Bull, C.F. Koppen, Arthur Müller, and the brothers Bruno, Edgar, and Egbert Bauer. And there were others. It was assumed Stirner was one of them, and the largest part of the critics in the subsequent half-century generally lumped him in the Hegelian left. But Stirner's book is the anti-Hegel, as Victor Basch elaborated nearly 60 years ago. And in an important sense, a thorough reading and understanding of Hegel is necessary to understand Stirner. The assault of the master was not an explicit one. However, Hegel is mentioned sparingly, though significantly, in a direct sense. It is through his younger exponents that Stirner propels his critique of this state and its related personifications and generalized ideas. It was in the company of these persons that such previews of Stirner as exist made their appearance. He published a few articles in the Hallische Jahrbucher and the Deutsche Jahrbucher, ephemeral journals edited by Arnold Rouge in the years just previous. They were largely ignored at the time and not made generally available for over half a century. It is in these that the germs of his anti-Hegelian revolt are first discerned. The history of Der Einzige is worthy of a glance. After its first appearance, it sank out of sight for nearly 4 decades. The original publishing house of Wiegand brought out a second edition in 1882 and a third in 1901. These latter two were separated chronologically by the 1892 Universal Bibliothek edition of Philipp Reclam Jr., also of Leipzig, in the famous miniature Ausgaben series, which found Stirner in the company of world-famous literature. The publication of a full-scale biography of Stirner by John Henry Mackay in 1893, it's probably John Henry Mackay, in 1893 preceded 2 translations in French, which were published one after the other in Paris in 1900, under the title L'Unique et sa propriété. These set the stage for the English translation and publication. The first American to dwell at length on Stirner was James L. Walker, a Texas newspaperman and later physician, and an associate of Tucker. Walker brought Stirner's egoism into the pages of Tucker's world-famous anarchist weekly, Liberty, with increasing frequency during the 1890s, and himself prepared a strongly Stirner-influenced book, The Philosophy of Egoism, published posthumously, Walker having died in Mexico in 1904. His introduction to the Tucker edition of Stirner was written in 1902 or 1903, evidence that Tucker planned to release the book in that time, though some unknown circumstance delayed its issuance. In a publishing career which went back to 1875, Tucker insisted that making Stirner available in English was his most important contribution in the entire time. After Tucker's property was burned out in the fire of January 1908, his work ended, but apparently the plates of this book were salvaged because editions in the identical format with that of 1907 came out in London and New York in 1913 to 1915 under different auspices, and a third by still another publisher was produced in New York in 1918. The history of Stirner's book in languages other than those examined above is obscure. There were Italian and Russian translations, and possibly in a Scandinavian language, as Stirner was very familiar to Henrik Ibsen and the Danish critic George Brandes, the latter having written at some length on Stirnerism. Huneker declared that the translation by the erudite philologist Stephen T. Byington was admirable, which is indeed a fact. He was aided in his work by Walker and by Emma Heller Schum and George Schum, all expert in German, so in one sense it was a cooperative project. Byington did the greater part of the work, however. His preface to the original edition is preserved here in order to illuminate some of the difficulties encountered in Stirner's frequently diffuse style, and his etymological references are preserved throughout the book in the original footnotes. His choice of the English title, The Ego and His Own, is especially felicitous. Friedrich Nietzsche was a few months old when Stirner's book was published, but no other thinker has been compared more to Stirner than Nietzsche, and perhaps with less evidence for it. A critical controversy raged among philosophers and academic people over this issue, in particular between 1890 and the First World War, and a literature of large enough scope exists on the subject alone to warrant a substantial book. Albert Levy, in his careful study Stirner and Nietzsche, points out that Stirner is not mentioned in either the works nor the correspondent of Nietzsche at any time, and with the exception of a single instance, Nietzsche appears not to have been aware of him at all. In the case of every writer who has tried to establish such a relationship, the method has consisted of dependence on inference and the coincidental similarities which can be established by superficial content analysis. This is the approach of considerable number of oversimplifiers, of whom Paul Carew is probably one of the best examples. Stirner was an uncommonly keen student of classical antiquity, the French Revolution, and the Bible in particular. The latter is his most quoted source by a wide margin. In one sense, this appears incomprehensible, considering Stirner's position on religion. Of this, more will be said shortly. An attempt has been made to annotate as many of Stirner's literary references and allusions as seems practical, in view of their number and his careless documentation. The latter in particular suggests the contemporary polemic part of his book. The sources are thrown about carelessly, like so much spare lumber, and the overall impression conveyed is that his readers are fully aware of their nature or have read them. The Ego and His Own is a piece of fierce writing, in an icy, relentless, epigrammatic style, as Huneker described it. Nothing distracts Stirner from his pursuit of the exposition of freedom. He is for freedom for everyone, not just himself, and he is consistent in not shrinking from the consequences of this pursuit. It may very well be that the largest number of mid-20th century individualists does not have the stamina to stick with Stirner to the bitter, logical end. The various libertarians are free to decamp at that point of the journey beyond which they no longer care to proceed. But it is their responsibility to know whence individualism stands and where its logic goes. No one has surpassed Stirner in dealing with these two aspects of the problem. There are uncanny portions of this work. One might cite in particular his discussion of the semantics of freedom and compare them with similar dissertations by George Orwell in 1984 and Eugen Zamyatin in We, those most exquisitely anti-Stirner worlds. Stirner, in a sense, was a pioneer in the area of general semantics. Stirner wanted all to be free. He was not arguing just for himself or for a special segment of mankind, but he stressed over and over the part of the one desirous of freedom had to play. Freedom was not something someone else gave you. All freedom is essentially self-liberation, says Stirner. His concern is with the individual rebel, not the revolution. It is as such that he respected Jesus, a rebel who concerned himself not a whit with the politics and the state of his time, but for organized Christianity and for all other organized religions. Stirner had particularly harsh words. Personal insurrection rather than general revolution was his message. He recognized the futility of meeting the authorities at street barricades with broom handles, at a time when the Romantics were still enamored with this concept. The age of automatic arms and instantaneous communication was just around the corner. The general revolution brought either socialism or a tyrant, in his view. The revolutionist merely exchanged masters, often for the worst. There are only 5 chapters in Stirner, 3 very short ones, separated by 2 very long ones, and it is in the latter that he has packed the very largest parts of his message. Though he assaults religion, philosophy, morals, every source of inspiration for authority, as for his principal target. Victor Bosch remarks, "L'État, voilà le grand ennemi, voilà le dénatérant de moi." All authority materials end up as arms and nutriment for the state, and Hegel and his chief disciples were the agents of his time, who appeared to be doing the most thorough job of preparing the world for the new secular Leviathan. Stirner was scornful of the German national unity fervour of the 1840s. He was almost completely untouched by one of the most uproarious political fermentations in the history of Central Europe. In his view, unity would be just the superimposing of a far more grim and ferocious monster for the existing 38 separate weaker ones of the existing states. He saw no net gain in replacing the ecclesiastic or monarchical state with the new secular product in the making. In fact, he was sure that the latter had immeasurably superior means and capabilities for oppressiveness. But if Stirner was appalled by the Hegelians, he was equally appalled by the communists. The ego in his own was a pitiless attack on communism well before the Communist Manifesto was published, and it is at the same time one of the most original and unanswerable critiques of coercive collectivism. A social associator, Friedrich Engels, published in one of the journals edited by Karl Marx, Stirner's socialist antagonists were Wittling and Hess, and the French propounders of the same ideology, all more prominent at that moment. Stirner saw clearly through the communist appeals of the 1840s, the seedbed of the manifesto. In particular, the talk of necessity of eliminating the state. He reiterated that communism would produce instead a state far more onerous than the royal, ecclesiastic, or bourgeois models communists fulminated against so tirelessly. Yet Stirner does not talk of future societies, or blueprints for them himself. For the most part, he avoids all soothsaying. The structure of the free union is beyond his ken, and he felt it was a futile field for prediction in the first place. As he says in one place of the slave, and the speculations as to his likely behaviour once his servitude is ended, one cannot know what he will do until he actually gets free. The century coinciding roughly with the end of the Second World War may be described ideologically as the age of Marx, during which Marxism was presumed to be victorious over Stirner and all other antagonists. The fact that Marx devoted such an immense part of his ponderous Die Deutsche Ideologie to an attack on Stirner was conceded to be the principal prima facie evidence of the former's triumph. A generation ago, Sidney Hook, in 2 widely acclaimed books, calmly reaffirmed that Marx demolished Der Einzige und sein Eigentum. It being nothing but a social defense mechanism of a petty bourgeois soul. Marxists long tended to display this cavalier attitude towards Stirner, generally without reading a line of his work. In fact, Marxist literary and intellectual influence for a time all but brought about Stirner's consignment to the memory hole of 1984 fame. But there is plentiful evidence that he, Proudhon, Bakunin, and the others against whom Marx tilted never lost their validity during this period. The last 2 decades in particular have seen the repeated reappearance of their works in various forms. As Herbert Reed declared in his masterful essay commemorating the centennial of Stirner's book, "After a sleep of 100 years, the giants whom Marx thought he had slain show signs of coming to life again." And indeed they have returned. Marx's criticism of Stirner Reed advanced in a famous second thought, would need drastic revision to be convincing today. As for critics of Stirnerite egoism such as Berdiev, Reed was of the view that Stirner could have handled him capably with a single sentence. Concerning Stirner's examination of love and his consistent plea in behalf of the integration of personality, Reed concludes with several impressive observations. He finds many modern views in such areas as held by Erich Fromm, Jung, Martin Buber, and even the existentialists, in very close rapport with, if not dependent on, Max Stirner. The fashionable day for ad hominem attacks on Stirner seems past. The ego and his own has demonstrated survival value. It deserves to be read in the same spirit and in the same way one reads The Prince. James Martin, Malibu, California, September 8th, 1962. I will pronounce Stirner as Stirner instead of the correct German Max Stirner in the rest of this book, though I do not believe that to be a tremendous problem for any person. All things are nothing to me. What is not supposed to be my concern? First and foremost the good cause, then God's cause, the cause of mankind, of truth, of freedom, of humanity, of justice. Further, the cause of my people, my prince, my fatherland. Finally, even the cause of mind and 1,000 other causes. Only my cause is never to be my concern. Shame on the egoist who thinks only of himself. Let us look and see, then, how they manage their concerns. They for whose cause we are to labour, devote ourselves and grow enthusiastic. You have much profound information to give about God, and have for thousands of years searched the depths of the Godhead and looked into its heart, so that you can doubtless tell us how God himself attends to God's cause, which we are called to serve. And you do not conceal the Lord's doings either. Now what is his cause? Has he, as is demanded of us, made an alien cause, the cause of truth or love his own? You are shocked by this misunderstanding, and you instruct us that God's cause is indeed the cause of truth and love, but that this cause cannot be called alien to him, because God himself is truth and love. You are shocked by the assumption that God could be like us poor worms in furthering an alien cause as his own. Should God take up the cause of truth if he were not himself truth? He cares only for his cause, but because he is all in all, therefore all is his cause. But we are not all in all, and our cause is altogether little and contemptible. Therefore we must serve a higher cause. Now it is clear, God cares only for what is his, busies himself only with himself, thinks only of himself, and has only himself before his eyes. Woe to all that is not well-pleasing to him. He serves no higher person and satisfies only himself. His cause is a purely egoistic cause. How is it with mankind, whose cause we are to make our own? Is its cause that of another, and does mankind serve a higher cause? No, mankind looks only at itself. Mankind will promote the interests of mankind only. Mankind is its own cause. That it may develop, it causes nations and individuals to wear themselves out in its service, and when they have accomplished what mankind needs, it throws them on the dung heap of history in gratitude. Is not mankind's cause a purely egoistic cause? I have no need to take up each thing that wants to throw its cause on us and show that it is occupied only with itself, not with us, only with its good, not with ours. Look at the rest for yourselves. Do truth, freedom, humanity, justice, desire anything else than that you grow enthusiastic and serve them. They all have an admirable time of it when they receive a zealous homage. Just observe the nation that is defended by devoted patriots. The patriots fall in bloody battle, or in the fight with hunger and want. What does the nation care for that? By the manure of their corpses, the nation comes to its bloom. The individuals have died for the great cause of the nation, and the nation sends some words of thanks after them and has the profit of it. I call that a paying kind of egoism. But only look at that sultan who cares so lovingly for his people. Is he not pure unselfishness itself? And does he not hourly sacrifice himself for his people? Oh yes, for his people. Just try it. Show yourself not as his, but as your own. For breaking away from his egoism, you will take a trip to jail. The Sultan has set his cause on nothing but himself. He is to himself all in all. He is to himself the only one, and tolerates nobody who would dare not to be one of his people. And will you not learn by these brilliant examples that the egoist gets on best? I, for my part, take a lesson from them, and propose, instead of further unselfishly serving those great egoists, rather to be the egoist thyself. God and mankind have concerned themselves for nothing but themselves. Let me then likewise concern myself for myself, who am equally with God the nothing of all others, who am my all, who am the only one. If God, if mankind, as you affirm, have substance enough in themselves to be all in all to themselves, then I feel that I shall make still less lack that, and that I shall have no complaint to make of my emptiness. I am not nothing in the sense of emptiness, but I am the creative nothing, the nothing out of which I myself as creator create everything. Away then with every concern that is not altogether my concern. You think at least the good cause must be my concern? What's good? What's bad? Why, I myself am my concern, and I am neither good nor bad. Neither has meaning for me. The divine is God's concern, the human man's. My concern is neither divine nor the human, not the true, good, just, free, etc., but solely what is mine, and it is not a general one, but is unique, as I am unique. Nothing is more to me than myself. Part the first. Man. Man is to man the supreme being, says Feuerbach. Man has just been discovered, says Bruno Bauer. Then let us take a more careful look at this supreme being and this new discovery. Chapter 1. A Human Life. From the moment when he catches sight of the light of the world, a man seeks to find out himself and get hold of himself out of its confusion, in which he, with everything else, is tossed about in motley mixture. But everything that comes in contact with the child defends itself in turn against his attacks, and asserts its own persistence. Accordingly, because each thing cares for itself, and at the same time comes into constant collision with other things, the combat of self-assertion is unavoidable. Victory or defeat, between the two alternatives the fate of the combat wavers. The victor becomes the lord, the vanquished one the subject. The former exercises supremacy and rights of supremacy. The latter fulfills in awe and deference the duties of a subject. But both remain enemies and always lie in wait. They watch for each other's weaknesses, children for those of their parents and parents for those of their children. Their fear, for example. Either the stick conquers the man, or the man conquers the stick. In childhood, liberation takes the direction of trying to get to the bottom of things, to get at what is back of things. Therefore we spy out the weak points of everybody, for which it is well known children have a sure instinct. Therefore we like to smash things, like to rummage through hidden corners, pry after what is covered up or out of the way, and try what we can do with everything. When we once get at what is the back of things, we know we are safe, and when we have got at the fact that the rod is too weak against our obduracy, then we no longer fear it, have outgrown it. The back of the rod, mightier than it, stands our obduracy, our obdurate courage. By degrees we get at what is the back of everything that was mysterious and uncanny to us. The mysteriously dreaded might of the rod, the father's stern look, etc. And back of all we find our ataraxia, our imperturbability, intrepidity, our counterforces, our odds of strength, our invincibility. Before that which formerly inspired in us fear and deference, we no longer retreat shyly, but take courage. Back of everything we find our courage, our superiority. Back of the sharp command of parents and authority stands, after all, our courageous choice, or our outwitting shrewdness. And the more we feel ourselves, the smaller appears that which before seemed invincible. And what is our trickery, shrewdness, courage, obduracy? What else but mind? Through a considerable time we are spared a fight that is so exhausting later, the fight against reason. The fairest part of childhood passes without the necessity of coming to blows with reason. We care nothing at all about it, do not meddle with it, admit no reason. We are not to be persuaded to anything by conviction, and are deaf to good arguments and principles. On the other hand, coaxing, punishment, and the like are hard for us to resist. This stern life and death combat with reason enters later and begins a new phase. In childhood we scamper about without racking our brains much. Mind is the name of our first self-discovery, the first undeification of the divine, that is, of the uncanny, the spooks, the powers above. Our fresh feeling of youth, this feeling of self, now defers to nothing. The world is discredited, for we are above it. We are mind. Now, for the first time, we see that hitherto we have not looked at the world intelligently at all, but only stared at it. We exercise the beginnings of our strength on natural powers. We defer to parents as natural power. Later we say, father and mother are to be forsaken, all natural power to be counted as riven. They are vanquished. For the rational, the intellectual man, there is no family as a natural power. A renunciation of parents, brothers, etc. makes its appearance. If these are born again as intellectual, rational powers, they are no longer at all what they were before. And not only parents, but men in general are conquered by the young man. They are no hindrance to him, and are no longer regarded. For now, he says, one must obey God rather than men. From this high standpoint, everything earthly recedes into contemptible remoteness, for the standpoint is the heavenly. The attitude is now altogether reversed. The youth takes up an intellectual position, while the boy, who did not feel himself as mind, grew up on mindless learning. The former does not try to get a hold of things, for example, to get into his head the data of history, but of the thoughts that lie hidden in things, and so therefore of the spirit of history. On the other hand, the boy understands connections, no doubt, but not ideas. The spirit, therefore, he strings together whatever can be learned without proceeding a priori, and theoretically without looking for ideas. As in childhood one had to overcome the resistance of the laws of the world, so now in everything that he proposes he is met by an objection of the mind, of reason, of his own conscience. That is unreasonable, unchristian, unpatriotic, and the like, cries conscience to us, and frightens us away from it. Not the might of the avenging Eumenides, not Poseidon's wrath, not God, far as he sees the hidden, not the Father's rod of punishment do we fear, but conscience. We run after our thoughts now, and follow their commands just as before we followed parental human ones. Our course of action is determined by our thoughts, ideas, conceptions, faith, as it is in childhood by the commands of our parents. For all that, we were already thinking when we were children. Only our thoughts were not fleshless, abstract, absolute, that is, nothing but thoughts, a heaven in themselves, a pure world of thought, logical thoughts. On the contrary, they had been only thoughts that we had about a thing. We thought of the thing so or so. Thus we may have thought God made the world that we see there, but we did not think of or search the depths of the Godhead itself. We may have thought that is the truth about the matter, but we did not think of truth itself, nor unite into one sentence, God is truth. The depths of the Godhead who is truth we did not touch. Over such purely logical, theological questions, what is truth, Pilate does not stop, though he does not therefore hesitate to ascertain in an individual case what truth there is in the thing, whether the thing is true. Any thought bound to a thing is not yet nothing but a thought, absolute thought. To bring to light the pure thought, or to be its party, is the delight of youth, and all the shapes of light in the world of thought, like truth, freedom, humanity, man, illumine and inspire the youthful soul. But when the spirit is recognized as the essential thing, it still makes a difference whether the spirit is poor or rich, and therefore one seeks to become rich in spirit. The spirit wants to spread out so as to found its empire, an empire that is not of this world, the world just conquered. Thus then, it longs to become all in all to itself, for although I am spirit, I am not yet perfected spirit, and must first seek the complete spirit. But with that I, who had just now found myself as spirit, lose myself again at once, bowing before the complete spirit as one not my own, but supernal, and feeling my emptiness. Spirit is the essential point for everything, to be sure, but then is every spirit the right spirit? The right and true spirit is the ideal of spirit, the Holy Spirit. It is not my or your spirit, but just an ideal supernal one. It is God. God is spirit, and the supernal Father in heaven gives it to those who pray to him. The man is distinguished from the youth by the fact that he takes the world as it is, instead of everywhere fancying it amiss and wanting to improve it, model it after his ideal. In him the view that one must deal with the world according to his interest, not according to his ideals, becomes confirmed. So long as one knows himself only as spirit and feels that all the value of his existence consists in being spirit, it becomes easy for the youth to give his life, the bodily life, for nothing, for the silliest point of honour. So long it is his only thoughts that one has, ideas that he hopes to be able to realize someday when he has found a sphere of action. Thus one has meanwhile only ideals, unexecuted ideas or thoughts, not till one has fallen in love with his corporeal self and takes a pleasure in himself as a living, flesh and blood person. But it is in mature years, in the man, that we find it so. Not till then has one a personal or egoistic interest, an interest not only of our spirit, for instance, but of total satisfaction, satisfaction of the whole chap, a selfish interest. Just compare a man with a youth, and see if he will not appear to you harder, less magnanimous, more selfish. Is he therefore worse? No, you say, he has only become more definite, or as you also call it, more practical. But the main point is this, that he makes himself more the centre than does the youth, who is infatuated about other things, for example, God, fatherland, and so on. Therefore the man shows a second self-discovery. The youth found himself as spirit, and lost himself again in the general spirit, the complete Holy Spirit, mankind, in short, all ideals. The man finds himself as embodied spirit. Boys had only unintellectual interests, those interests devoid of thoughts and ideas. Youths only intellectual ones. The man has bodily, personal, egoistic interests. If the child has not an object that it can occupy itself with, it feels ennui, for it does not yet know how to occupy itself with itself. The youth, on the contrary, throws the object aside, because for him thoughts arose out of the object. He occupies himself with his thoughts, his dreams, occupies himself intellectually, or his mind is occupied. The young man includes everything not intellectual under the contemptuous name of externalities. If he nevertheless sticks to the most trivial externalities, such as the customs of student clubs and other formalities, it is because and when he discovers mind in them, when they are symbols to him. As I find myself at the back of things, and that as mind, so I must later find myself also at the back of thoughts, to wit, as their creator and owner. In the time of spirits, thoughts grew until they overtopped my head, whose offspring they yet were. They hovered about me, and convulsed me like fever fantasies, an awful power. The thoughts had become corporeal on their own account, were ghosts, such as God, Emperor, Pope, Fatherland, etc. If I destroy their corporeity, then I take them back into mine, and I say, I alone am corporeal, and now I take the world as what it is to me, as mine, as my property. I refer all to myself. If as spirit I had thrust away the world in the deepest contempt, so as owner I thrust spirits or ideas away into their vanity. They had no longer have any power over me, as no earthly might has power over the spirit. The child was realistic, taken up with the things of this world, till little by little he succeeded in getting at what was back of these very things. The youth was idealistic, inspired by thoughts, till he worked his way up to where he became the man, the egoistic man, who deals with things and thoughts according to his heart's pleasure, and sets his personal interest above everything. Finally, the old man, when I become one. There will still be time enough to speak of that. Chapter 2. Men of the old time and the new. Content warning. Stirner uses some, to put it charitably, outdated language in this chapter, specifically regarding the word negroid. Men of the old time and the new. How each of us developed himself, what he strove for, attained or missed, what objects he formerly pursued, and what plans and wishes his heart is now set on, what transformation his views have experienced, what perturbations his principles. In short, how he has today become what yesterday or years ago he was not, this he brings out again from his memory with more or less ease, and he feels with a special vividness what changes have taken place in himself when he has before his eyes the unrolling of another's life. Let us therefore look into activities our forefathers busied themselves with. A. The ancients. Custom having once given the name of the ancients to our pre-Christian ancestors, we will not throw it up against them that, in comparison with us experienced people, they ought properly to be called children, but will rather continue to honour them as our good old fathers. But how have they become to be antiquated, and who could displace them through his pretended newness? We know, of course, the revolutionary innovator and disrespectful heir, who even took away the sanctity of his father's Sabbath to hallow his Sunday, and interrupted the course of time to begin at himself with a new chronology. We know him, and know that is the Christian. But does he remain forever young, and is he today still the new man? Or will he too be superseded, as he has superseded the ancients? The fathers must doubtless have themselves begotten the young one who entombed them. Let us then peep at this act of generation. To the ancients the world was a truth, says Feuerbach. But he forgets to make the important addition, a truth whose untruth they tried to get back of, and at last really did. What is meant by those words of Feuerbach will be easily recognized if they are put alongside the Christian thesis of the vanity and transitoriness of this world. For as the Christian can never convince himself of the vanity of the divine word, but believes in its eternal and unshakable truth, which, the more its depths are searched, must all the more brilliantly come to light and triumph, so the ancients on their side lived in the feeling that the world and mundane relations, such as the natural ties of my blood, were the very truth before which the powerless I must bow. The very thing on which the ancients set the highest value is spurned by Christians as the valueless, and what they recognized as truth these brand as idle lies. The high significance of the fatherland disappears, and the Christian must regard himself as a stranger on earth. The sanctity of funeral rites, from which sprang a work of art like the Antigone of Sophocles, is designated as a paltry thing. Let the dead bury their dead. The infrangible truth of family ties is represented as an untruth which one cannot promptly enough get clear of, and so in everything. If we now see that to the two sides opposite things appear as truth, to one the natural, to the other the intellectual, to one earthly things and relations, to the other heavenly, the heavenly fatherland, Jerusalem that is above, etc., it still remains to be considered how the new time and their undeniable reversal could come out of antiquity. But the ancients themselves worked towards making their truth a lie. Let us plunge at once into the midst of the most brilliant years of the ancients, into the Periclean century. Then the sophistic culture was spreading, and Greece made a pastime of what had hitherto been, to her, a monstrously serious matter. The fathers had been enslaved by the undisturbed power of existing things too long for the posterity not to have learned by bitter The fathers had been enslaved by the undisturbed power of existing things too long for the posterity not to learn by bitter experience to feel themselves. Therefore the sophists, with courageous sauciness, pronounced the reassuring words, "Don't be bluffed," and diffuse the rationalistic doctrine, "Use your understanding, your wit, your mind against everything. It is by having a good and well-drilled understanding that one gets through the world best, provides for himself the best lot, the pleasantest life." Thus they recognize in mind man's true weapon against the world. This is why they lay such stress on dialectic skill, command of language, the art of disputation, etc. They announce that mind is to be used against everything, but they are still far removed from the holiness of the spirit, for to them it is a means, a weapon, as trickery and defiance serve children for the same purpose. Their mind is the unbribable understanding. Today we should call that a one-sided culture of the understanding, and add the warning, cultivate not only your understanding, but also and especially your heart. Socrates did the same. For if the heart did not become free from its natural impulses, but remained filled with the most fortuitous contents, and as uncriticized avidity, altogether in the power of things, nothing but a vessel of the most various appetites, then it was unavoidable that the free understanding must serve the bad heart, and was ready to justify everything that the wicked heart desired. Therefore Socrates says that it is not enough for one to use his understanding in all things, but it is a question of what causes one exerts for it. We should now say one must serve the good cause. But serving the good cause is being moral. Hence Socrates is the founder of ethics. Certainly the principle of the sophistic doctrine must lead to the possibility that the blindest and most dependent slave of his desires might yet be an excellent sophist, and with keen understanding trim and expound everything in favour of his coarse heart. What could there be for which a good reason might not be found, for which might not be defended through thick and thin? Therefore Socrates says, you must be pure-hearted if your shrewdness is to be valued. At this point begins the second period of Greek liberation of the mind, the period of purity of heart. For the first was brought to a close by the sophists in their proclaiming the omnipotence of the understanding, but the heart remained worldly minded, remained a servant of the world, always affected by worldly wishes. This coarse heart was to be cultivated from now on, the era of culture of the heart. But how is the heart to be cultivated? What the understanding, this one side of the mind, has reached, to wit, the capability of playing freely with and over every concern, awaits the heart also. Everything worldly must come to grief before it, so that at last family, commonwealth, fatherland, and the like are given up for the sake of the heart, that is, of blessedness, the heart's blessedness. Daily experience confirms the truth that the understanding may have renounced a thing many years before the heart has ceased to beat for it. So the sophistic understanding too had so far become master over the dominant, ancient powers that which they now needed only to be driven out of the heart, in which they dwelt unmolested, to have at last no part at all left in man. This war is opened by Socrates, and not till the dying day of the old world does it end in peace. The examination of the heart takes its start with Socrates, and all the contents of the heart are sifted. In their last and extremest struggles, the ancients threw away all contents out of the heart, and let it no longer beat for anything. This was the deed of the skeptics. The same purgation of the heart was now achieved in the skeptical age, as the understanding had succeeded in establishing in the sophistic age. The sophistic culture has brought it to pass that one's understanding no longer stands still before anything, and the skeptical, that his heart is no longer moved by anything. So long as man is entangled in the movements of the world and embarrassed by relations to the world, and he is so till the end of antiquity because his heart still has to struggle for independence from the worldly, so long he is not yet spirit. For spirit is without body, and has no relations to the world in corporeality. For it the world does not exist, nor natural bonds, but only the spiritual and spiritual bonds. Therefore man must first become so completely unconcerned and reckless, so altogether without relations as the skeptical culture presents him, so altogether indifferent to the world that even its falling in ruins would not move him, before he could feel himself as worldless, that is, as spirit. And this is the result of the gigantic work of the ancients, that man knows himself as being without relations and without a world, as spirit. Only now, after all worldly care has left him, is he all in all to himself. Is he only for himself? Is he spirit for the spirit, or in plainer language, he cares only for the spiritual? In the Christian wisdom of serpents and innocence, of doves, the two sides, understanding and heart, of the ancient liberation of mind, are so completed that they appear young and new again, and neither the one nor the other lets itself be bluffed any longer by the worldly and natural. Thus the ancients mounted to spirit, and strove it to become spiritual. But a man who wishes to be active as spirit is drawn to quite other tasks than he was able to set himself formerly. to tasks which really give something to do with the spirit, and not to mere sense or acuteness, which exerts itself only to become master of things. The spirit busies itself solely about the spiritual, and seeks out the traces of mind in everything. To the believing spirit, everything comes from God, and interests him only to the extent that it reveals this origin. To the philosophic spirit, everything appears with the stamp of reason, and interests him only so far as he is able to discover it in reason, that is, spiritual content. Not the spirit, then, which has to do with absolutely nothing unspiritual, with no thing, but only with the essence which exists behind and above things, with thoughts. Not that did the ancients exert, for they did not yet have it. No, they had only reached the point of struggling and longing for it, and therefore sharpened it against their too powerful foe, the world of sense. But what would not have been sensuous for them, since Jehovah, or the gods of the heathen, were yet far removed from the conception God is spirit, since the heavenly fatherland had not stepped into the place of the sensuous, etc. They sharpened against the world of sense, their acuteness. To this day the Jews, those precocious children of antiquity, have got no further, and with all the subtlety and strength of their prudence and understanding, which easily becomes master of things and forces them to obey it, they cannot discover spirit, which takes no account whatever of things. The Christian has spiritual interests because he allows himself to be a spiritual man. The Jew does not even understand these interests in their purity because he does not allow himself to assign no value to things. He does not arrive at pure spirituality, a spirituality such as is religiously expressed, for instance, in the faith of Christians, which alone, without works, justifies. Their unspirituality sets Jews forever apart from Christians, for the spiritual man is incomprehensible to the unspiritual, as the unspiritual is contemptible to the spiritual. But the Jews have only the spirit of this world. The ancient acuteness and profundity lies as far from the spirit and the spirituality of the Christian world as earth from heaven. He who feels himself as free spirit is not oppressed and made anxious by the things of this world, because he does not care for them. If one is still to feel their burden, he must be narrow enough to attach weight to them, as is evidently the case, for instance, when one is still concerned for his dear life. He to whom everything centres in knowing and conducting himself as free spirit gives little heed to how scantily he is supplied meanwhile, and does not reflect at all on how he must make his arrangements to have a thoroughly free or enjoyable life. He is not disturbed by the inconveniences of the life that depends on things, because he lives only spiritually and on spiritual food, while aside from this he only gulps down things, like a beast, hardly knowing it, and dies bodily, to be sure, when his fodder gives out, but knows himself as immortal as spirit, and closes his eyes with an adoration or a thought. His life is occupation with the spiritual, is thinking. The rest does not bother him. Let him busy himself with the spiritual in any way that he can and chooses, in devotion and contemplation, or in philosophic cognition. His doing is always thinking, and therefore Descartes, to whom this had at last become quite clear, could lay down the proposition, I think, that is, I am. This means my thinking is my being or my life. Only when I live spiritually do I live. Only as spirit am I really, or I am spirit through and through, and nothing but spirit. Unlucky Peter Schlemihl, who has lost his shadow, is the portrait of this man become a spirit, for the spirit's body is shadowless. Over against this, how different among the ancients. Stoutly and manfully as they might bear themselves against the might of things, they must yet acknowledge the might itself, and got no farther than to protect their life against it as well as possible. Only at a late hour did they recognize that their true life was not that which they led in the fight against the things of the world, but the spiritual life. Turned away from these things, and when they saw this, they became Christians, the moderns, the innovators upon the ancients. But the life turned away from things, the spiritual life, no longer draws any nourishment from nature, but lives only on thoughts, and therefore is no longer life, but thinking. Yet it must not be supposed now that the ancients were without thoughts, just as the most spiritual man is not to be conceived of, as if he could be without life. Rather, they had their thoughts about everything, about the world, man, the gods, etc., and showed themselves keenly active in bringing all this to their consciousness. But they did not know thought, even though they thought of all sorts of things, and worried themselves with their thoughts. Compare with their position the Christian saying, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, as the heaven is higher than the earth, so are my thoughts higher than your thoughts." And remember what was once said about our own child thoughts. What is antiquity seeking, then? The true enjoyment of life. You will find it at the bottom. It is all the same as the true life. The Greek poet Simonides sings, "Health is the noblest good for mortal man. The next to this is beauty. The third, riches acquired without guile. The fourth, the enjoyment of social pleasures in the company of young friends." These are all good things of life, pleasures of life. What else was Diogenes of Sinope seeking then for true enjoyment of life, which he discovered in having the least possible wants? What else Aristippus, who found it in the cheery temper in a cheery temper under all circumstances? They are seeking for cheery, unclouded life courage, for cheeriness. They are seeking to be of good cheer. The Stoics want to realize that the wise man, the man with practical philosophy, the man who knows how to live a wise life, therefore they find him in contempt for the world, in a life without development, without spreading out, without friendly relations with the world, thus in the isolated life, in life as life, not in life with others. Only the Stoic lives, all else is dead for him. The Epicureans, on the contrary, demand a moving life. The ancients, as they want to be of good cheer, desire good living. The Jews especially a long life, blessed with children and goods, eudaimonia, well-being in the most various forms. Democritus, for example, praises as such the calm of the soul in which one lives smoothly, without fear and without excitement. So what he thinks is that with this he gets on best, provides for himself the best lot, and gets through the world best. But as he cannot get rid of the world, and in fact cannot, for the very reason that his whole activity is taken up in the effort to get rid of it, that is, in repelling the world, for which it is yet necessary that what can be and is repelled should remain existing, otherwise there would be no longer anything to repel. He reaches at most an extreme degree of liberation, and is distinguishable only in degrees from the less liberated. If he even got as far as the deadening of the earthly sense, which at last admits only the monotonous whisper of the word Braham, he nevertheless would not be essentially distinguishable from the sensual man. Even the Stoic attitude, and manly virtue, amounts only to this, that one must maintain and assert himself against the world and the ethics of the Stoics, their only science, since they could tell nothing about the spirit but how it should behave towards the world, and of nature, physics, only this, that the wise man must assert himself against it, is not a doctrine of the spirit, but only a doctrine of the repelling of the world and of self-assertion against the world, and this consists in imperturbability and equanimity of life, and so in the most explicit Roman virtue. The Romans too, Horace, Cicero, and others, went no further than this practical philosophy. The comfort, hedon, of the Epicureans is the same practical philosophy the Stoics teach, only trickier, more deceitful. They teach only another behaviour toward the world, exhort us only to take a shrewd attitude toward the world. The world must be deceived, for it is my enemy. The break with the world is completely carried through by the skeptics. My entire relation to the world is worthless and truthless, Timon says. The feelings and thoughts which we draw from the world contain no truth. What is truth, cries Pilate? According to Pyrrho's doctrine, the world is neither good nor bad, neither beautiful nor ugly. But these are predicates which I give it. Timon says that in itself nothing is either good or bad, but man only thinks of it thus and thus. To face the world, only ataraxia, unmovedness, and aphasia, speechlessness, or in other words, isolated inwardness, are left. There is no longer any truth to be recognized in the world. Things contradict themselves. Thoughts about things are without distinction. Good and bad are all the same, so that what one calls good, another finds bad. Here, the recognition of truth is at an end, and only the man without power of recognition, the man who finds in the world nothing to recognize, is left, and this man just leaves the truth-vacant world where it is, and takes no account of it. So antiquity gets through with the world of things, the order of the world as a whole, but to the order of the world, or the things of this world, belong not only nature, but all relations in which man sees himself placed by nature, as in the family, the community, in short, the so-called natural bonds. With the world of the spirit, Christianity then begins. The man who still faces the world armed is the ancient, the heathen, to which class the Jew too, as non-Christian, belongs. The man who has come to be led by nothing but his heart's pleasure, the interest he takes, his fellow feeling, his spirit, is the modern, the Christian. As the ancients worked towards the conquest of the world and strove to release man from the heavy trammels of connection with other things, at last they came also to the dissolution of the state and giving preference to everything private. Of course, community, family, and so forth, as natural relations, are burdensome hindrances which diminish any spiritual freedom. I think I'm going to pause there